It's a real honor and privilege to introduce Amanda Dennis to you, for those of you who don't know her well, and allow you to reconnect with her, those of you who haven't seen her for a while, and particularly to launch, this is not the first, and it certainly won't be the last launch of her novel, Her Here, which I have a copy in my very hand. Here it is. Huge congratulations. I timed it so as I would actually finish it very recently, because I wanted it to be very fresh in my mind. It really is a huge achievement. I'm really bowled over by it. So I'm still in that flush of excitement. So I just want first to introduce the Center for Writers and Translators to any of you who might not be familiar with it. It was set up in 2007 to promote writing and to keep a record to some extent of writing and activities around writing, creative writing at AUP, with a particular focus on translation. With my colleague, Daniel Midden, currently in the underworld, we must have hosted close on, I think, 100 events since then. And we have to date published 36 of our cahiers in the cahier series. I wonder, Will, could you share the screen? Or just so, for those of you who aren't familiar with, what's that, Amanda, sorry, yeah. Familiar with the center, that we do have quite a nice in fact, very nice web page, explaining the center, and these are the cahier series. And we also have pretty much an exhaustive list of the participants in the center's activities. We don't yet have Amanda, but she'll be joining that list very soon. So this is the cahier series. That's, I suppose, the most lasting of our achievements, 36 to date. I'm working on number 37. And they're, pretty well recognized. When I go to literary festivals, and when Daniel does, which he does much more than I, people do come up to us and sort of in amazement that we're the people who run this series, because it's attracted quite a lot of attention, and they're beautiful. So that's that. The person who's helping us here, whose image you can also see, is not William Fisher, though we're using, that's the provost of AUP. That's his name. This is Will Ihrig, who's our student helper at the Center for Writers and Translators, and he's kindly helping us with the management of this evening. So over to the more exciting bit of Amanda. Amanda studied at Princeton, at University of California, Berkeley, and between that, Cambridge University, between the two. Where she got her PhD from Berkeley, and after that she did an MFA at the Iowa Writers Workshop, where she was awarded I'm not sure how you pronounce it, a whited fellowship, sorry about that, in creative writing. And she spent a year as the Princeton in Asia Fellow, which I presume is what took her to Thailand, and because a large bit of her book happens in Thailand. So that comes very directly into Her Here. Her book on Samuel Beckett, entitled Beckett and Embodiment, Body, Space, Agency, will be out soon. I'm not quite sure, I presume this year, since I know you've been doing the proofs, with Edinburgh University Press. She's an assistant professor of comparative literature and creative writing at the American University of Paris. So just a brief note for those of you, if we were doing this in person, there would be a healthy stack of Amanda's novels on our desk for you to purchase. We can't do that, but it is available, as they say, in all good bookshops. In Paris, Shakespeare and Company, Red Wheelbarrow, Galignani, I think they all are aware of it and probably have it in stock or shortly will have. You're encouraged, if you're in the US, to use bookshop.org, and UK Watterson's or Blackwell's. Maybe, Will, you can put in the chat Amanda's personal website, which gives you more information, and I believe there's some links there to where the book is available. Okay, that's my introduction. And I'd like then to ask Amanda to say a bit about the novel, enough for us, let me switch on some light here, enough for us to be able to understand. I've asked her to read a bit, and this will be the shape of the evening. Amanda's going to read, I think, from the opening of her novel, and then I'm going to ask her some questions, unrehearsed, and then ask her to read a second, both times quite short passages, and then we'll open up to all you guests to have, if you have questions or want to ask Amanda anything about her work, that will be the chance. Yeah, over to you, Amanda.
Great. Well, thank you. I want to just start by saying thank you so much for being here on this beautiful day to help celebrate this book. It's wonderful to see you all. And I also want to thank Will Ihrig and Daniel Medin for helping get this event organized, and especially to you, Dan, for being in conversation with me. And so I thought I'll start, as Dan has asked me to do, by telling you a little bit about the book, what it's interested in thematically, and sort of what the main axes of its narrative are. So it's the story of Elena, who's a late 20-something, not quite able to find her way in the world. And she goes to Paris to do a research assignment. And in Paris, she meets an estranged friend of her late mother, a woman called Siobhan, who she thinks is sort of elegant and bizarre. And the two strike up this unusual friendship. And Elena soon realizes that Siobhan has this tragedy. She's lost, a daughter has disappeared 6 years before the novel opens. And Elena finds herself agreeing to look at the diaries of this young woman who's disappeared, Siobhan's daughter. And no sooner does she agree to do this project, she finds herself really engaged in the work of looking at the diaries, of reading the diaries, and of transforming them into a narrative to try to find out what happened to Ella, why she disappeared, where she might be. And Elena starts to sort of do some strange things. She starts to lose her own sense of identity, and she finds herself imitating or acting out a lot of Ella's mannerisms, the girl she's looking for. And so it kind of goes on like that. A lot of the novel is Elena's reconstructed narrative. So it's a novel within a novel. And I think one of the things that the book is really interested in doing is this work of kind of imaginative projection. What is it to sort of be in another person's mind and skin and body? And so that's sort of what the novel is interested in thematically. So I will read to you from the beginning, which is, you know, a good place to start. And it's a short reading. It's only about 5 minutes, so it'll be good. This is Elena's arrival in Paris. I have been up all night, and now the day is gray. The narrow street slick and silvered outside the taxi window. Sleeplessness gives the city an unreal, varnished air. Shops, shutters, pigeons, and trees all flickering and chromed, like movie stills cut together in the old way. The driver stops along stone steps that lead uphill. He tells me again that the street I am looking for does not exist. On the ride from the airport, he spoke of his childhood in Montmartre, of parties in squares strung with lights, where children were allowed to stay up dancing. As he spoke, he looked into the rearview mirror, his gaze warm, soliciting. Sometimes I give the impression of not paying attention, but I'm gleaning all I can from the present, encoding it carefully. It is unlikely that this man, who has lived here all his life, does not know my street. Perhaps he is right. None of it is real. Siobhan, the flat, the missing girl. I find the Place Marcel Aimé on my GPS and show the driver. His bright laugh fills the car. He swivels into reverse. Maybe I was mispronouncing the name. On the square, which exists, my eyes travel up the building facade, balcony after balcony, to a dome with a topmost window, which will be mine. Through sheets of cloud, sun strikes the wet brick and stone. Looking up like that gives me vertigo. By the door, which faces the square, a tree sways under its burden of pink, excessive blooms. At the square's far end, people are gathered. They are looking at something hidden from my view by their windbreakers and backpacks. When the group drifts away, I approach, leaving my suitcase by the door. The statue is of a man stuck in the wall, or emerging, I can't tell. His face of dark bronze is resigned. His fingers, long and expressive, reach toward me out of the stones. rubbed gold by many eager living hands. As I move to touch the fingers, a high, shrill voice stops me. Isa! A woman from the tourist group is gazing at me from the street. Isa, she says again, and runs down the slope that joins the street to the square. Embarrassed, I stand still, my legs taking root among the stones. My face is one people think they know, and strangers will often tell me I remind them of someone. When she sees me up close, this woman too will find some detail in my face to set her right. She'll apologize, ashamed of her error, but aglow with the memory of whomever she took me for. Now she runs across the square, her black hair loose behind her, her low heels unsteady on the cobblestones. She reaches me, breathless, and takes my hands, pressing them to her chest. Her forehead is broad, and her eyes are black and wet with tears. Isabel, she says. Her smile makes me want to smile too. No, I say. She steps back and studies me, probing my gaze for recognition. But Isabel, it's you. Of course it's you. She laughs again, but more sadly this time, performing a calculation. If it was you, you wouldn't tell me, she says, squeezing my hands. Her touch is warm, her skin a little dry. No, I'm not her. I'm not Isa. My name is Elena. I'm sorry. I am sorry. I've hurt her without meaning to. To appease her, I ask, when did you know Isa? Isabel. The ground of stones swells up like the sea, and the woman looks at me with such confusion that I turn away, embarrassed, and move quickly with my suitcase into the building. Leaning against a wall of mirror in the foyer, I watch her retreat across the square. A scene like this shouldn't bother me so much, but the world is strange today. I've been awake all night, crossing the ocean, and now I can't shake her look of need. I'm not Isa, but the time I've lived and don't remember deprives me of certainties. I'm sick of grasping, still, for the strong, solid shore where life can begin. I imagine myself arriving at Ella's door, or finding her on a beach or in a square, and saying, Ella, Ella, do you know how long your mother, your real mother, has been looking for you? I'll bring them together, mother and daughter. I can do nothing for the woman outside, but I can help Siobhan. I believe that Ella is alive and can be found.
Thank you, Amanda. A very sort of banal and obvious question first is, could you tell us a little bit about the genesis of the novel? What set you on this path?
Yeah, it's got kind of a two-pronged genesis, I guess. It's on the one hand, as you said in your introduction, I had spent some time in Thailand as a young woman, kind of like Ella in the novel, although not like her in a lot of other ways. But I knew that when I was living there, I really wanted to write about this time in my life because of the way it challenged the things that I had taken for granted, certain kind of cultural norms, things that I'd grown up with, things that that seemed to be so much a part of kind of the texture of things that I hadn't really looked at them. And so I knew that there was a part of me that really wanted to find a way to write about Thailand and about my immersion in the culture and my attempt to learn the language and this feeling of just sort of moving and living in a very different culture with very different values than the ones that I was used to. So there was that on the one hand, and then on the other, and I began this novel a few years after I started graduate school. And I was reading and thinking a lot about French theory and philosophy, and particularly this idea of this idea that there's an otherness at the heart of the self. And I was really, really interested in this idea, but couldn't quite make sense of it in terms of lived experience. What does it mean to have this alterity, this otherness at the heart of the self, and what does that actually look like? And so I think I started playing with a scenario that would enable me to kind of think in really concrete terms about these ideas. And I think those were sort of the scaffolding of the book, and luckily they fell away and the story kind of took over. But I do think there was a really genuine desire to try to understand some of the theory to which I was being exposed in kind of human terms. So that's part of how the book got started and how the two characters grew.
Unmute. Sorry, thanks. That makes a lot of sense. Especially as you move on towards later second half of the novel, that sense that Ella being the woman that Elena is looking for, somehow the language itself starts to become foreign to her. And one thing that sort of intrigued me is that the novel's replete with figures who in some sense mirror each other. And in an ideal world would complement one another. They're doubles almost, or doppelgangers almost, I think. And they're nearly all female. I think I saw one possible male double pairing towards the end, Aidan and Adrian, possibly. Yeah. So again, mirrored, echoed a bit in their names. But that's a very late, a late bloom. So we have Elena, Ella, where the names already give us a clue that there's something. And then Ella and Aurelia, and the mothers, of course, of Ella and Elena, who have been very close friends and in a way complemented each other, and then were sort of pulled apart in some way. Siobhan and Elena's mother, Ida. I was wondering if you could just say a bit about, is that something that you were consciously working on, or did it just emerge like that? Am I right first in my feeling that there's doubles, and then what were you trying to sort of explore there? Or?
Yeah, you're definitely onto something with the doublings. There are probably too many. It's a bit like a hall of mirrors, but without kind of making you too dizzy, I'll maybe unpack some of the pairings. The first, the one you mentioned about the male doubles, Dan, is I think one of the things that I was interested in as Elena starts to create a narrative about Ella is that she's pulling material from her own life. And so she meets this very charismatic brother of Siobhan. And so she starts to kind of use some of his mannerisms as she creates this character of Anthony who lives in Thailand. So there, if you look closely, there are certain characters in Elena's kind of real frame life that start to take on, that start to kind of bleed into the characters in the novel that she's writing. So that there's that sort of more general doubling. But I think the really more specific and intentional doubles that appear in the book are, of course, Elena and Ella, and their relationship is one, I guess, of kind of some resemblance. It becomes very easy for Elena to project herself into Ella, and I think part of that has to do with the relationship that their mothers had. Their mothers had this very, very strong friendship in the 1970s in London, and they were very, very close. And Elena is mourning her own mother, and she finds, even in Siobhan's physique, something that reminds her of her own mother. And so she fits very easily into she finds this immediate way of relating to the daughter of this woman who reminds her so much of her own mother. And I think there is this play of kind of surrogacy in the novel, how Elena is sort of looking for a mother and Siobhan is looking for a daughter, and I think that's certainly at play. So there's a certain projection. There's also the similarity of their names, which is sort of tricky, I guess. But I think Elena sees herself a little bit in Ella, and the closeness of their names makes it very easy for her to project herself into this woman's life. The other doubling that I wanted to maybe touch on, which I think in some ways this is maybe more of a classical doppelganger, and it's about midway through the book, and it's inside the Thailand narrative, the novel within the novel. And a woman from the East Coast of the United States, this is also where Ella is from, arrives to the village, and she has the same coloring as Ella, and they have the same build, and a lot of the people confuse them because they're sort of two teacher foreigners, and they maybe look a little bit alike. And I think it's really destabilizing for Ella to kind of be misrecognized. And I think I mean, as you saw in the opening that I read, misrecognition is also something that the book is really interested in. And I think for Ella, who's living in Thailand, living away from home, going through all kinds of um, experiences, she she's kind of she's disarmed by seeing this woman who, by being mistaken for someone else. And there's a scene when she watches Aurelia walk outside of the glass door of their house, and she kind of watches Aurelia walking and thinks she's so different from me, yet there's something I see something of myself in her. And I think in some ways the way that Ella relates to Aurelia enables her to see a kind of vulnerability in herself that she's not always able to access. So.
Thanks. Yes, that makes a lot of sense. And then, yes, and then of course we sort of sense them parting ways as well later on. Yeah, yeah. Another question. So both the protagonists, the main protagonist, so I suppose you could say one is only a protagonist within the mind of the first protagonist. Ella exists in a way, well, in her notebooks, but also in her diaries, but mostly through the words that Elena accords to her. So, so both the protagonists, Elena the writer and Ella the subject of her readings and writings, have undergone a trauma that we learn of fairly early on. So I'm being quite careful not to do spoilers. In the case of Elena, it's the death of her mother that seems to have provoked a sort of hole in her memory that you've alluded to, several months that she can't recollect, and around which this hole, her whole existence, seems to have become vulnerable and precarious, that you actually already gave us an indication of in that opening passage. And in the case of Ella, it's the discovery, I'm not sure, I think it's at the age of 21, that the two figures whom she took to be her parents are not her biological parents, that she was given up for adoption at a very young age as a baby, and that this fact was kept from her. So just wondering, because it's something that we think about quite a lot, I think, in our teaching as well, maybe you could talk to us a bit about both the challenges and the rewards of writing about trauma, because I do think it's partly a book about trauma.
Yeah. It's yeah, I mean, the challenges are numerous. I think for me, I think with Ella's adoption, it took kind of a little bit of research on kind of experiences of adoption and what that can do to one's sense of identity, and kind of reading accounts of people who've been adopted. And some of the research for that kind of particular feeling happened through dialogue with another writer friend who was adopted and who found out in kind of early adulthood, like Ella, that he was adopted. And I think that really makes one, it kind of shakes to the core one's sense of identity. And I think that is probably my interest in writing about trauma, this sense of feeling one's identity solicited, realizing that one's not who one thinks one is. And I think in some ways, that's part of what it is to grow up, to reach adulthood, to find these little bits of strangeness in the self, and to sort of need to unpack them and and make peace with them and recognize them. But I think the challenge of writing about trauma is one where you want to keep a kind of buoyancy in the writing, a kind of energy. And I think if done in the right way, writing about trauma can give a kind of like, almost magnetic pull, a tautness to the writing, if it's something that, the character is sort of turning over in the mind, and and looking to find a resolution for. And I think that's very much Elena's case. She doesn't really know what she's looking for. It's kind of vague to her. But somehow when she gets this project, when she sees that there's a girl who's missing and she can maybe help, that sort of mobilizes her into action. And suddenly she feels full of purpose and full of, you know, full of kind of spirit and energy. And so I think writing about trauma is difficult in that you kind of need to find the ways in which there's a kind of eagerness to find out more about a situation that might bring some kind of resolution, even if that resolution is always only ever going to be provisional and illusory. So I guess, yeah, it's a tricky thing to write about, and I realize their traumas are kind of mirroring each other in that they're both about identity.
And you do, I mean, it's very, I don't want to say elegantly because that suggests sort of some belletrisme, but it's very powerfully done, because in both cases it's just like a hole in there. It's not something they can see directly. Both is a type of amnesia for Elena, and I suppose a sense of which we sort of infer from Ella's notebooks, that there's a sort of, oops, Daniel, someone's joined that's giving me a, someone has to mute. In Ella's notebooks, you can infer that the learning of her parentage has somehow created this sense of having lived a lie, or her, and that's in a way, you leave that fairly open, I think. It's whether her trauma is suddenly realizing that her parents weren't her parents, or more that she's been living some sort of told a lie, basically, or a lie by silence. Curiously, at AUP, I've seemed to have had loads of students who learn this facts like this late on. It's not a, you know, doing creative writing or even just teaching literature. I've been really surprised at the prevalence of something quite similar to this. I don't know if it's something about the parentage of AUP students, where often very itinerant parents, and yeah, it's obviously not nearly as uncommon as one could imagine. But I do think, as you say, that the sort of this sense of this something missing, you convey very, very powerfully. And the sense of it sort of building up around the edges, or maybe at the center, but the center becomes a sort of periphery of these people's existence, rather than just simply describing an awful experience, which, you know, is not really a trauma. In that sense, I think you've formally found a way, structurally or formally, to somehow really give a sense of how awful this has been for these two people. Another question I had was, this, as the novel's title suggests, is a novel very much about women. We've talked about the mothers, the daughters. Mothers have a central role, where fathers are almost entirely absent. It's a bit like quite a lot of Shakespeare plays are a bit like that. The two men who do emerge are the two main male characters, are very different from one another, I think, and they're clearly not doubles in any obvious sense. That's Zed, or probably Z in American, who seems just not giving anything away, but he seems conscientious, concerned, serious, rather grounded, somewhat needy, somewhat conventional. And Sebastian, or Seb, who's wayward, unrooted, profligate, promiscuous, unreliable, and Ella, with whom Ella has a strong attachment. So Elena is or has been attached to Z, and Ella to Seb. What is it about these male figures that gives them this influence? What are they doing there?
Yeah, I think with Z, I think Elena is sort of always trying. She's a little bit circumspect in that Z has had this role because he was with her at the time when she, you know, right around the time of her mother's death, she's unable to remember the months immediately following it, and this gives her this sense of kind of, as you say, Dan, a kind of hole in her memory, and memory is so connected to the self, and I think so. She when she looks back at that time, it's incredibly destabilizing for her, and Z has been such a part of her life. You know, he's been at her side, you know, through late adolescence for the last 10 years. They've been a couple, and I think he's there to say, you know, I remember that time. I can be that memory for you. And I think she's kind of saying, huh, I don't know whether to trust that. You know, I'm not sure I want someone else to be my memory. And so I think when she does go to do the, you know, to take on this project of looking for Ella, it's partly a way of saying, like, let's take some distance from this and see, you know, see how this is working. Maybe there's something I can unlock. And I think that's also the sort of underlying temptation for Elena. You know, maybe something she reads about Ella will somehow unlock something in her own life. And then Seb is just such a fun character to write. He's the nomad, he's the explorer, he's the, you know, and I find him incredibly, partly, you know, I find him at times sort of interesting. I feel like some readers have a very adverse reaction, and you know, he certainly does things that are reprehensible. But I think he was a really enjoyable character to write, just because he's someone, you know, who's you know, also a little bit lost, but also very engaged in sort of trying to do his best to live fully. And he's of course the object of unrequited love for Ella that kind of drives her a bit mad.
Probably unrequited love.
Yes, right. I won't give anything away.
No, probably, and probably that way around. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, he did remind me of, I mean, having spent you know, some time in the Far East myself, he did remind me of these sort of characters that you find in expat. I mean, many of us are expats in Paris, but you're not really an expat in Paris, I don't think. But if you go, I imagine, to Thailand, but certainly to Hong Kong or to Japan, where I've been, you do meet these characters who just, you know, will never fit in their own worlds. They somehow have to keep moving. Yeah, I think I'm probably on the side of those who didn't find him as, I mean, I wanted to kick him quite a lot, but that's, I'm sure, the idea partly. You know, he's not, his fascination for Ella is she knows it's not exactly doing her much good at that. Yeah. But
moving. You know, I think where Z is someone who's quite fixed and stable, you know, Seb is someone who's always moving. He's a kind of moving target, and I think that's part of the allure for Ella.
Yeah, yeah, of course. In your webpage under scholarship, you say the following, and I thought it would be an interesting way to into an aspect of the novel that I really enjoyed, and it seems to me to draw upon perhaps your, you know, literary interests and your philosophical background. I don't know how many people are aware that you've worked for a long time on philosophy and on phenomenology in particular. So you write there, my research interrogates the body's implication within its natural and built environments, end quote. So there's a great deal about bodies in the novel, and about architecture and about nature. I mean, architecture is more maybe in the Paris side and nature is more in the Thai side, but both actually have a bit of each. There's a very, very strong sensual appeal to the Thai passages. Both Elena and Ella seem, if I'm reading right, to have lost or perhaps willingly to have discarded certain of the coordinates or grids that of time and place that allow habit, habit being the great deadener, as I think as Vladimir calls it in Waiting for Godot, to take over from the phenomenal world, and it's a command that habit allows the phenomenal world to stay in place, so as we don't have to pay attention to it all the time. It stays out there rather than somehow in here. And it seems to me a lot of the novel that I really enjoyed is that doing something around this. So I'll quote a couple of sentences from first one from chapter 4. Well, in a way, it's almost random because I could really open just about any page and find something that illustrates what I'm trying to not very eloquently say. This passage says, outside, the sky is an arresting blue. It swoops down to meet the cobblestones and narrow strips between the buildings. I think in the passage, end of quote, the passage you read, the stones surge up, perhaps. Or this time from chapter 16, quote, you can't write anything more than what you taste, hear, see, smell, touch. And it's only in the arrangement if it breaks new form that shadows wake to life. So maybe mixing up things or combining things that you don't want to put together, but it's all by way of asking you if you could talk a bit about the phenomenology of your novel.
Yeah. I think first of all, it's just a really canny reading of both characters to identify the ways in which they're interested in kind of cracking apart the sort of coordinate grids we use to sort of order experience, and how there's the hope, I think, especially in Ella's case, that something kind of more vital is gonna come through if she can just sort of bash it, the habit. And I think both of the characters achieve this sort of dislocation or this distance from habit by traveling outside of the zones in which they're comfortable. And I think, in the passage you read, this is Elena, who isn't, she's not, I think Ella is an incredibly kind of passionate character who really just wants to kind of be a little destroyed by life. That's something I think she says at some point in the book. But and I think Elena is a little bit more cerebral. She does sort of like to see things in a more, perhaps a little bit more of an intellectual way. But I think she's unsettled, first by her arrival in Paris, and then by her encounter with Ella. So I just wanted to say, yes, absolutely. That's such an interesting reading of both characters, and how they how they let themselves really be kind of overcome at times by the kind of force of their sensations. And I think, with phenomenology, yes, I'm very, very interested in it. I don't think there's a phenomenological thesis in the book, or that I'm trying necessarily to that I'm trying to sort of make any point. But and I guess I should also say that I'm interested in phenomenology not necessarily as a search for first principles, maybe in the German tradition, but I'm interested in French philosophy, and the way that in French philosophy, especially in Merleau-Ponty's work, and he's the philosopher about whom I wrote my dissertation, he imagined, or his idea is that the body is the self. The self is not something cut off from the world, but the self is the way in which the body's perspective as it moves through the world. So our perceptions, the sensory world, these are not things that sort of trick us and take us away from a kind of ideal form, but rather these are the things that help us, understand anything at all. So I do think I was reading a lot of phenomenology while I was writing this, and probably there is a mark of that reading and of that thinking. And I have to say that I think the moments that, for me, when I think about the book, are maybe most that bear the kind of heaviest footprint of phenomenology are those moments early on in the book when Elena is trying to get into Ella's experience through the journals. And she's saying, I wish, she kind of laments the fact that she only has language. She wishes that she could get into Ella's body and actually see the way that her kind of angle of vision cuts through the world. And she longs for that. And she realizes that there's a limitation to how much she can see through language. And I think that's probably where a lot of the phenomenology is coming in. But you said something else that I wanted to respond to, because I thought it was really interesting. Just the mention of nature and the idea of the body sort of becoming overwhelmed or overcome by the world. And I think that this is something that Ella, the sort of more passionate Thai character who lives in Thailand, really wants and fears. I think one of the first things she does in Elena's reconstructed narrative when she arrives in Thailand is that she carves her name in a little wooden cabinet in her apartment, because she thinks, this is just so I don't disappear entirely, so that there's some kind of mark of who I am. So I think that this is something for Ella especially. She's always kind of thinking that she's going to be overtaken by nature, by experiences, by sensations. So she's the kind of passive, passionate character. Dan, you may be muted still. I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Yes, sorry. I was thinking that there is quite a tradition of literature, obviously going back to Romanticism, of people losing themselves in nature. But thinking particularly in Australian literature, where nature is pretty hostile, where people go into walkabout and outback, and there's a sense of that happening somewhere in the novel as well that I've really admired. I have a last question, and then maybe ask you to read a little bit again, and then open it to everyone else. So this is a novel very much not just about writing, but about reading as well. It's this without actually becoming, there is a novel within the novel, but it's very subtly done, so it doesn't feel metafictional in a sort of particularly obvious or playful or postmodern sense, I don't think. As you've outlined for us, Elena has been employed by Ella's mother, Siobhan, to write Ella's story in such a way as to reveal an element, Ella's current whereabouts, so there's a detective side to it, that's not obvious to the uninitiated reader of Ella's journals. So it's an exercise in hermeneutics, but also in what you can think called projective imagination. She has to be the ideal writer or rewriter of Ella's journal. And that this links to this several mentions in the novel of translation, that she has to be a translator in a sense. So Elena has to become an ideal reader before she can be a writer. So I was just wondering if you could talk to us a bit about this relationship between reading and writing in the novel. It's obviously it's relevant not just to your novel, but to your academic writing and to your teaching as well. And if it's, there's just that one quotation that I typed out there. All writing is translation. Experience is just darkness until it's lit from behind, like a negative. That's Siobhan that says that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny, we talk a lot in, I'm teaching literary translation this semester, and with my students, we talk a lot about this idea of translation being an intimate act of reading. I think that comes from Gayatri Spivak, but I'm not 100% sure. So I think there's definitely this double imperative that Elena has, where she's supposed to be a good reader, someone who can create that sort of intimacy with Ella's journals and really kind of project herself into them, really feel what Ella is feeling and sort of retrace her steps in that sense, and really try to kind of empathically inhabit this other person's life. But at the same time, she's reconstructing a narrative from these rather impressionistic journals that don't always make a lot of sense. And I think there's a sense in which the work of narrative, I think, is important to this particular kind of translation, because it's not, it's not a literal translation. It's not coming from one language into another. It's coming from a kind of a sense of impressions into a narrative that functions according to rules of causality, that might be able to shed some light on what Ella was thinking and why she disappeared, and why she makes certain decisions that she makes that lead to her disappearance. So I think there's this kind of this double work of being asked to really immerse herself in the journals, and then at the same time create a framework or a structure so that she won't slide entirely into this other woman's life. And so I think that's the complexity of her particular work of translation, that need of making these journals legible in a kind of causal sense. And I think also her ability to do that is what's going to guarantee her own survival, her own kind of mental health at the end of this, her ability to keep herself separate. But I think I did sort of use pretty consciously this idea of the detective novel as in a very kind of tongue-in-cheek way almost. But I do think there's something really wonderful and propulsive about the detective novel, this idea that there's a solution to things and that we just need to find the kind of causal chain. And I find that actually is something that really can kind of tighten the gears of narrative.
Yeah, well, I think it's a good moment to celebrate Barthes, because our former colleague Kate Briggs won this enormous prize recently. And I think as Barthes somewhere says that all novels are detective novels in some way, and that Oedipus is the original one. So in that sense, yeah, there is that. I hope you won't mind, I hope you won't take this amiss, but I find myself quite often thinking of The Bourne Identity when reading it. If you've seen that movie, have you seen the movie?
I feel like I might have, but I think it was so long ago that I probably
Matt Damon in sort of bionic form, because he has also got a hole in his memory. and he's traveling all over the world trying to find it. But it's not a commercially it would be not a bad analogy. It's a good movie. I can't remember who, someone famous wrote the book. Yeah, so there has that feeling of something really, that born feeling slightly, for those who know the movies or the novels. Thanks. I'm going to ask you then to read a second passage, and then I'm going to hand it over to our audience.
Okay. Great. Well, I'm going to read a passage from about 2/3 of the way through the novel, and we're well inside of the Thailand narrative. So we're with Ella, and she decides to spend about a month at a Vipassana on a Vipassana retreat at a monastery. So this is her experience at the monastery, and she's taking the experience very seriously. She wants to obey all of the rules, but she's finding that the restrictions are a little much for her. She's not able to eat solid food after midday, and she's very hungry in this episode. So she meets a stranger who manages to get her something to eat. The other thing that you might want to know about this episode before I begin is also that the bhikkhuni is just the word for a female monk. And then Pranu is a character, one of the monks at the monastery, who kind of takes care of administrative details, whom Ella has befriended. So this is Ella at the monastery. The present, hot, makes the joints of the world disengage. Salt tears in the library, can see no humanity past my own. Mind blown open, turns, returns, fingernails on the buttons of Seb's shirt, meditate on rotting flesh to combat lust. Intestines voided themselves regularly. My body a hollow tube secreting. Mind bound to sickly flesh, bobbing, rocking on uncomfortable seas. Skin chalk white as the sky. The bhikkhuni brought me tomatoes, saying I needed color in my cheeks. I refused, wanting the full experience. She sat before me, patient, a tomato in each upturned palm. Finally, I took one and sucked at the skin indifferently. With the burst of seeds and juice, there was sensing, taste. Lethargy broke, pure exuberance for the rest of the day. One day, I asked Pranu about the other meditation students. The man who walks more quickly than the others? Yes, yes. He signs the ledger as the man from Augsburg. He doesn't give his name. Why? Is he really from Augsburg? Pranu shrugged. He didn't know. Every year he comes on the same day and stays 3 months. His practice is not typical. He does no sitting meditation and walks too fast. We have to warn novices not to imitate him. They always try. He builds to 20 hours of meditation per day. In his last week, he stays in his room and sees no one. We bring him food, but he won't eat. And no one knows his story? Look at how he walks, Pranu said, exasperated. It's there, his story. You want more than that? You're nosy, worse than I am. He laughed. Now go meditate. Gongs announced the morning meal. Mouthfuls of Pali prayer, laminated transliterations of Thai and English on the tables. Word designs like serpents would slip into the tympanum through the cavities of the eyes. Breakfast was rice in a watery stew of what may have been vegetables. I left with my usual hunger, which felt like nausea. There would be another meal at noon, then no solid food. Some afternoons there would be ice cream, which is only artificially solid, like all things. Words scooped of meaning collected against me like cicada shells. Way of words. Sibilance just sensation when its semantic privilege peels away. Language carries disease in the form of desire. When the noon gongs sounded, I lined up at the refectory, thinking only of tomatoes, skin, color, taste on my tongue. Feeling a hand on my tunic, I turned, wanting to fall against this body, anybody, so as not to have to stand. White hair shone in the sun. He beckoned. Hesitation was brief. ineffectual in the face of my curiosity. We crossed the temple grounds and slipped between the bars of the north gate. His presence focused my thoughts. His smell was patchouli wood. Outside the monastery, a sidewalk curved through conifers and palms. "You won't survive like that," he said, walking ahead of me. "Rules are important, but you must break them to oblige the intuition. Otherwise, you lose it." "Isn't that the point?" I asked, struggling to keep pace with him. "To lose your intuition?" He turned to look back at me. "No. But fasting lessens sense desire. It's a way toward freedom. Discipline and moderation regulate sense desire, not murdering one's natural instincts. Do you listen to everything one tells you?" I said nothing, concentrating on the path. Proper care of the body and its desires is necessary to a full life. Asceticism on retreat is maddening. Turns out pliant fools, he said, turning to look me up and down. Or messes. The walk was invigorating once I learned to lengthen my stride to keep pace with him. We crossed the street, veering away from the monastery. "Where are we going?" I asked. "Oh, now you're curious. I was starting to worry about you." A tuk-tuk careered around the bend and accelerated past us. We came to a clearing by the road where there was a bamboo thatched hut and plastic tables on packed dirt. A plump woman was frying noodles in a large wok. I felt relief. A restaurant. "Sawadee ka," she called. Aromas woke the senses. Herbs frying, the snap of shrimp as they sweated and turned pink. We sat at one of the tables. My hunger was a hollowness that was almost painful. The man from Augsburg was speaking. Words echoed. The world looked large, like a fishbowl. "Ignore the body," he was saying. "How without nutrients? We have a proverb. The Thais would agree, but it's German. Der Mensch ist, was ist. You can't forget your body. Because what is living other than desiring, dying, eating, fucking?" My body cringed at the blow of each of his consonants. Black dots danced before my eyes. "Beautiful stuff," he said, leaning in. "They say you fast in your last days here," I said. "I fast to feed my hunger, like trimming the wick of a flame."
Thanks, Amanda. I'll turn it over to you, audience. I'm not sure the best way. Probably the best way is just I don't see questions in the chat. So best way is if you want to speak to Amanda, have a question or just a comment, then just turn on your mic and ideally your camera as well.
Sure, I can start out if I'm not cutting in line. But I'm audible and the microphone is working. Great. Well, thanks again, Dan and Will and Amanda, of course, for the reading and for this event. Amanda, I'm curious about. I'm always interested in the relationship between creative and critical approaches, especially among those writers who teach. And I suppose, you know, this is something that's funny, even in the title, somebody who's familiar with Beckett, the immediate association, not that Beckett has ever written something that I can recall called Her Here, but that kind of stutter with a variation is something that is very much in the key of Beckett. And so it wouldn't have surprised me had I known after seeing that title, she's written she does scholarly work on Beckett as well. I'm curious as to the ways that in which, especially while writing the novel, you find the particular methodologies of literary scholarship creeping into, or perhaps influencing or shaping your creative practice, something that is taught as a craft, and I'm curious as to the way it works in the other direction as well from time to time, that as somebody who's the experience of writing fiction, I think it has to alter the way that you conceive it in the way that you teach it in the classroom. So I suppose if I had to restate that as a kind of coherent question, it would be like, over the course of writing this novel, you know, to what extent do you find your approach to fiction has been shaped by some of your experience as not just a passive reader or even an active reader in her own world, really immersed in the text, but as somebody who has to take that into, you know, into academe, into conferences, into the classroom.
Yeah. First, let me say, Daniel, I'm so glad you find kind of Beckettian echoes in the title. That makes me so happy. That wasn't at all intentional. It comes from a line early in the novel, but I'm delighted that there are Beckettian echoes there. And I think your question is such a fantastic one. And I imagine that there are a lot of you in the audience that also kind of work in both a creative and both in creative and critical registers. So I'm curious about others' experiences as well. I think that for me, I think working as writing kind of about Beckett in the vein of literary criticism, I think what that has done for me is it's made me a really intimate reader. And I do think that writing comes from reading, and writing comes from reading so intensively that, you know, that you're moved to write, and that it's part of a larger conversation. So I'm really glad that I have had the opportunity to do that kind of intensive reading and to really spend a lot of time with language and with texts. I'm not sure that my critical writing has been very good for my creative writing, and it's something that I've had to be pretty vigilant about keeping out of my creative writing. I think that when we write critically, the impulse is to explicate, to sort of unfold meanings. And I think in some ways, when you're writing creatively, you don't want to say everything. If you say everything, it kills it. You know, you want to create those silences. You want to kind of bring ideas or sensations just close enough so that there's a kind of magnetic leap that the reader can make. And then so you're sort of, you know, folding things up again, I guess, when you're doing creative writing. So I remember actually when I showed my kind of creative writing to people, I had these very humbling experiences of people saying, too much, you know, too much explication, we know already. And I think that's still something that I'm always watching for in my writing, just that tendency to maybe say just one thing. But I think on the other hand, working on fiction has been great for my critical writing. I think I have a sense of narrative. I have a sense of, you know, at least I think I do. I hope I do. But I realized once I actually started, once I began kind of writing in the context of an MFA program and really doing a lot of work trying to understand how narrative works, trying to understand how to make fiction. I realized that for some reason my academic articles were getting accepted and published with much greater success than before. So I do think I feel like these are really uneasy bedfellows, and I have not found a very elegant way of doing both at the same time. I find when I'm switching from one to the other, it takes me time, takes me transition time. So that's my experience.
There is I don't know if it's a great tradition, but there's certainly a tradition of people, of great writers who have worked closely on Beckett. I'm thinking obviously of John Coetzee, who did his PhD on Beckett and went on to be, you know, the writer he is. So a nice tradition to be in. There's a question in the chat, Amanda, from one Christopher Dennis, who you may know.
Hi, Dad.
Maybe I'll read it. Amanda, one of the compelling features of your novel is the play of interlocking narratives. Could you share with us your conversations with your editor about how the strategy for using different fonts or italics for Ella's journal, Elena's reconstruction, and the central narrative voice emerged? Was this approach always part of your plan for the novel, or did it evolve and emerge as you proceeded?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because I was really against using different fonts in the novel. I really didn't want that. I thought that if I were to craft this novel well enough, that the transition to every transition would be perfect, in the reader's mind, and that I just needed to make it better, and that this was going to be, I needed to sort of prove that I could do it. So I felt like using different fonts was sort of a, um, I don't know, a kind of crutch. But I think that the decision to use different fonts came really late in the editing process as well. It wasn't until the novel went to proofs that the discussion came up. And I'm trying to remember, I'm thinking I might have actually discovered that they'd used a different fonts when I got like a sample of the proof. But I'm going to back up a little bit and just say what the parts of the novel are. It's written in three first person voices, and the first is Elena's, first person account of her life in Paris. The second is Ella's journals, which are in italics, and that's Ella's voice. And the third is the reconstructed narrative that Elena writes about Ella. And I I was fine with having the journals be italics. I thought that was a very good idea, but I resisted a little bit having the reconstructed narrative be in a different font. But I my editor is really excellent, and she said, it's subtle. It's possible to read the novel without even really noticing the different font, but it will sort of prime people maybe subliminally to realize that they're in a different narrative, and it's just an easy typographical way of signaling the shift, because it does ask a lot of a reader to sort of jump between these three first person voices. And yeah, so making those three voices distinct was really a challenge for me writing the novel, and it was something I needed to kind of work on by taking the novel apart and writing each section on its own and then putting it back together again. But the sort of typographical distinction came very late, and I had mixed feelings about it. But I think I'm okay with it now. I think it was a good choice.
Unmute. Sorry, very interesting question, and I seem to remember just talking about it a bit with you as well when it was work in progress. And I should say the Ella reconstruction is a sort of sans serif font, which I guess is maybe a wee bit closer to something handwritten than, or something less sketchy, a bit more sketchy than the serif font of the main narrative. Yeah, great. Other questions?
I think Eula has one.
Eula, you have a hand up.
Yeah, thank you very much also for reading it. Reading to us from your novel, I enjoyed it very much. I must confess I got it already and have started reading it. I'm not yet through, so I'm very glad that you didn't give too many spoilers. So I'm curious how it will all end and whether everyone will survive. One question I had was, especially since you mentioned Thailand, why Paris? And how do you actually deal with that cliche of the American in Paris finding themselves?
Eula, could I ask you to do something? I heard maybe half of that. Could you put some of it in the chat, or maybe the big points in the chat, just because
Oh, sorry.
Missed some of what you said, what you asked.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm having the wrong headphones now. That's the problem.
Thank you for reading it. I'm delighted.
So sorry, I'm using remote headphones. I'm not used to them. So I didn't consider that that's not a good audio. Why and how avoid the American?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Why Paris, and how to avoid the cliche of the American in Paris? Yeah, that was really a difficult thing. I think, I was one of those people. I think in my own life, I came to Paris. I didn't really have the this sort of fantasy about Paris, I came here because I needed to do some dissertation research. So in this like what I feel like is a very characteristically naive way, I sort of encountered the myth, that Americans have about Paris only after I was living here. I remember kind of getting my hair cut in the US and someone said, "You live in Paris?" And I just thought, okay, so I did realize when I was writing this that this was going to have to be something that I needed to steer clear of. So I think one of the things that helped was making sure that Elena had a very specific purpose to reason why she was going to Paris, and this was to research the French filmmaker Chris Marker. And so she was working on her dissertation, and she was here just for a very short period. The other thing that was important to me was to really and it was really to describe the sort of parts of Paris that don't get sensationalized, and so to really to really talk about the sort of the vegetable market on the Rue de Jean, which is kind of where I live now. But I remember when I was first in Paris and kind of wandering around Montmartre, just seeing some of the textile makers and some of the really kind of and just kind of getting into the specificity of the neighborhood. And I hope it worked. I hope that I managed to steer clear of the cliche of the American in Paris. But it was something that I did think about how I could avoid that. Oh, Carrie has a question in the chat. She asks if there is any nod to Elena Ferrante happening in your novel. Well, Carrie, this is going to out me. I was actually working on this novel, and I'd come up with the name of Elena before the Elena Ferrante boom, or at least before I knew about the Elena Ferrante boom. But I'm an avid reader of Elena Ferrante, and I remember, like, I did think, I remember thinking, wow, she has the same name as this character in my novel. How great! I'll have to read everything. But it's not a real name. But I think the other interesting thing about Elena Ferrante is that when I started to have early conversations with Erica Goldman, the editor at Bellevue Literary Press, about the novel, she said, first of all, the novel, when she got it, was 100 more pages. It was really bulky. And she said, we're going to need to cut it down a lot. And she said, one of the things that she was most interested in about the novel is this element of a kind of existential thriller. There's something quite like horrific about the idea of this woman kind of losing her identity and taking on that of another. And she said, by the way, have you read the early Elena Ferrante novels? Have you read especially Troubling Love? Which is also very much, it's about a mother who disappears, and the daughter starts to sort of take on characteristics of the mother and relive scenes from her life to try to figure out what happened. Anyway, it was really uncanny. So at that point, I'd read the quartet, but not the early novels. And so I have this really wonderful memory of going through all of the early Ferrante, Troubling Love, Days of Abandonment, and I had read the Lost Daughter, the one about the dolls, which so I remember kind of going through the Ferrante and thinking, okay, how is she doing this? How is she making this creepy? So I feel like there is a nice connection with Elena Ferrante, even though it's not really an intentional one.
Kind of a virtual collaboration.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thank you for the question.
I would like to ask a question if possible. Okay. I actually have two, but one I think will be short. So the first one is about your writing process, because I'm quite curious. I feel like every writer is different. So anything about your creative process and writing process. Maybe you thought of this a long time ago and have been working on it slowly, etc. And then my second question is, do you have a favorite line from the novel?
Ooh. I mean, I think just to answer the last one, I think I did. It changes a while, but the line "I'd rather be her than here" was a line that really echoed in my mind. And when the editor said, "Oh, by the way, your working title, you can't possibly use this working title. Too many books have this title." That line kind of popped up, and so that's how the title came to be. So maybe that's my favorite line of the moment. I think your question about writing process is a really, really interesting one. And I know that just the way that I work, I'm a reviser. Um, I don't let people see my rough drafts. I just don't. I keep those hidden and far away from other eyes. I realized that for me, a lot of the really exciting work happens for me when I'm revising. I tend to kind of write long, messy first drafts, and then kind of come back to it once I've realized what it is that I'm doing, and then I really shape it. I shape the language, and I'm, as many drafts as it takes, I'll do, to really get it to the point where um, it's kind of sharp and it's having the effect that I want it to have. Um, and I guess, I mean, maybe you're also asking about the larger project, which is something that's been with me a long time. I think the concept of this novel has been with me a long time. Of course, it's undergone different drafts and different iterations, and I've had to change things quite drastically. But I think I knew that I wanted to write about these two women who were only really allowed to meet each other through writing. So,
Thank you.
Other question, we've probably got time for one or possibly two more questions, and then I'll ask Amanda to close our evening by reading a final passage.
I'd like to ask a question if...
Yeah. Go.
Okay, cool. I love that question about font, and I'm always thinking about relationship between form and content and form and font. But I was wondering if you started off with this idea of having three different first-person narratives, or that kind of evolved as you worked with the story. Could you tell us more about that?
yeah, it did. I mean, that's a great, it's a great question. I think for me, I knew that I wanted to have little fragments of the journals appearing in the work, and I knew that that was something I wanted to kind of craft and create. But I think it started out with the character of Elena, who now has a substantial portion of the novel dedicated to her life in Paris. I think at the very beginning, I did not want her to have a very big role. I wanted her to be a cipher. I just wanted her to be like the vehicle through which this story got told. And so the less about her, the better. And so I think that the genesis of the novel was really in this story that she's writing, and just not having much about her at all. She came in sort of very in sparing ways, and like wouldn't say much about herself. And I think part of the work of revision for me was building out her character and making her making actually the novel really about her more than the younger woman. But yeah, I think the evolution of those, I guess to answer your question directly, I think those three parts of the narrative were always there, but the proportions changed.
Nice, very nice. And Jeff has a question.
Sure. I'm slightly nervy about asking you because I haven't read her here, and I'm very excited now to read it, Amanda. I wanted to ask also about first-person narrative. The second passage you read was really striking as a piece of first person. It's the kind of first person that makes you think there can be something like free and direct first person, which feels an odd idea. I wondered just about whether there are limits to first person for you, whether they're frustrating at all, especially for person in place. Does it? Yeah.
Sorry, what was the last thing you said?
Maybe especially for a body in a place, when the circuit, the phenomenological circuit is always there, and the alterity of the other place is always the character's alterity of the other place.
Jeff, I'm so excited that you said that about what you said about the kind of free and direct in the first person, because that's what I was really trying hard to do with Elena writing the narrative of Ella in the first person. So that's really cool that came through. I found myself by the end of this really frustrated with the first person and feeling like I could very much understand its limits, and I understand why traditional narrative is not in the first person, it's third person past tense. And I think there's a lot that, yeah, I mean, I think there are limits to how close you can get to a character, and I think I had the most trouble with Elena, because she was the one I struggled kind of getting close enough to her in the first person, especially because I was writing in the first person present tense, and I needed to do that because I needed to do that because she doesn't know what's going to happen in her life. She doesn't have things. She is the kind of narrative. She is the kind of after the fact for Ella, who can cast narrative form back on Ella's life, but she doesn't have that for her own. So she had to be in the first person. I mean, sorry, she had to be in present tense. Whereas Ella's novel, the novel about Ella, could be in past tense, and the journals were just in whatever tense, they happen to be, whatever tense I happen to be in the mood for, or what would make sense given what Ella's recounting. But yeah, I think with the first person, it's hard. I mean, when there's a flaw, it has to be, you have to kind of describe how that person is seeing and find a way to let the reader, clue the reader into what the eye is missing, what the eye is not seeing. And that is really hard, I think. So I like the first person. I think the first person is wonderful for voice. It can really, I find for me, having a kind of distinctive voice comes more easily in the first person, but I feel like it is kind of harder to get really, really close to a character in terms of what they're seeing.
Thanks, Amanda. Thanks, and I'm sure there are other questions, but nothing in the chat. So I think time is moving on, and people know how to get hold of you anyway, your fan club, and know now how to get hold of the book. So maybe just ask you to close our evening with a final reading.
Sure. This is a very, very short reading, and it gets us really into the thick of the kind of existential thriller. So this is a scene with Elena, and Z has arrived in Paris to surprise her, and she can't stop thinking about Ella. So this is her really having an episode where she feels what's happening to Ella. So it's again very short. Z and I rent a car and drive to the countryside. When we reach the Loire, we hike. Winter woods, naked trees. Z's cheeks are pink in the cold. I ask if he is tired, jet-lagged. He says he isn't. Familiar feel of his gloved hand. He says that Paris seems to agree with me. He asks when I'm coming home. Instead of answering, I begin to tell him about the monstrous 50-page entry made in one sitting, the same mood in her pen strokes during the monsoons. No mention in so many pages of where she had been the last 10 days. You'll crack the case and come home, Z says, linking my reply to his question. He says it lightly, a joke. He goes on. I wasn't sure you'd be glad to see me. I almost didn't come, but it's better to know. Know what? I say, feeling sharper. Are you happy to see me? Of course. Then why didn't you answer about visiting? It's been 4 fucking months, Elena. Z is blurry, like a stranger. Part of me knows that 4 months are significant, our longest separation. Another part isn't sure what interest this adult, smartly dressed man holds for me. This project is demanding, I say. I just want to focus on it entirely, at least for this year. This, right now, is distraction, Z says. In the best way, I say, feeling trapped. Z looks at me suspiciously. He asks if I can picture the extra room in his apartment, the one with the window onto the courtyard. It could be my study. He asks me to think about it. We walk on, leaves crunching under us. Are you sure you're not becoming too involved? Z asks. What about your work? You mean the dissertation? I say, trailing off. Proud of myself for remembering, for being able to have this reasonable conversation with him, as myself, as Elena. It feels tedious to explain to him that I can't go back before finding Ella. I know that she has more to give me, some secret to being alive. And what about us? Z asks. I want to be grateful to him for having come so far. The ticket, purchased at the last minute, was probably expensive. I know he came to save our relationship, but my mind is stuck on that gap in July. On our last night in the countryside, full moon over an unfamiliar landscape, Z breathes beside me in the dark. Awakened by a sense of terror, I go to turn over. Stop. Something is wrong. Like her, I don't want to know. Like her, I am full of dread. The bed is sticky, wet. The smell is too much. The smell of the body, nauseating and intimate. I turn, warmishness spilling. No physical pain, just shock. Another wave. Thighs sticky. Top sheet blackening in the moonlight. I try to push myself to a sitting position, afraid of what's flowing out of me. I try to stand. Legs not my own. They don't support my weight. Elena? Z's eyes are black in the shadows. What's wrong? I show him my hands. I gesture to the blood soaking through the bed. What's wrong? He repeats. The blood, it's... Where? Z sits up, alarmed, runs his hands over the mess, pulls back the sheets. Where? I shake my head to show that it is everywhere. Suddenly wide awake, he takes my shoulders and pulls my face close to his. His eyes are very wide, serious. Look at me, he says. He shakes me. There is no blood. Do you see, Elena? No blood. Do you see? Sensation of falling. A body falling somewhere, not my own. In the morning, there is sunlight in the room. I look for traces of the mess and can find none. We have breakfast on the winter porch and drive back to Paris.
Thank you, Amanda. Wow. Yeah, I think only what is left to me to thank everyone for coming or being there, being here, being there, wherever it is that we're meeting. And thank Daniel Medden for helping set it all up and Will for conducting it. And above all, thanks to Amanda for writing the book, I guess. That's the main thing. And then for presenting it to us. And can't recommend it too highly. And we'll meet again there'll be at least a couple, 2 or 3 more Centre for Writer and Translator events over the course of the semester. And I hope to meet you there. Just wish we could all, I'm afraid mine's a cup of tea still, but raise a glass to Amanda and her novel. Thanks very much for everyone for joining us.
Thank you so much for coming. It's really wonderful to see you. I'm so pleased.